I will join the table. Let's also have Charlie Cooper, Sheila Ruth, Hank Prensky, Mike Mineta, Argentine Craig, and Mike Tidwell. I'm not sure there are enough seats. I'm not sure I see all of those people. I don't see Mr. Tidwell, I don't think.
Mr. Tidwell's in the House, and
Okay.
maybe he could get here closer to the end of the hearing, please.
Okay. I am going to join you, then come back to the chairman's position.
Yeah. Sheila follows me.
Shouldn't Sheila be here?
Good afternoon, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to present resolution number 1. I think it's number 1, right?
Right.
It is, SJ1. In 2010, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, and I think it's important to note, a 5-4 decision, ruled in Citizens United versus the FEC, Federal Elections Commission, in a ruling that overturned some lower court decisions that resulted in a decision that allows corporations, or in fact union coffers, and not just PACs, and I want to come back to this in a minute, to be used for independent expenditures. Prior to 2010, if an organization created a voluntary PAC of its membership, its employees or its membership, voluntary, that could be a fund that could be used on spending on elections. But the 2010 decision changed all of that. Based on the justification of free speech, it now allows corporations to take money from their coffers, from their corporate money, whether it's profit, operating, and I've used the example before and I'm going to use it again. If you pay your bill to Comcast, Comcast can take money from their coffers and spend it on a candidate's election as an independent expenditure. And we're told that's free speech. In 2014, 4 years later, in the McCutcheon case, McCutcheon v. FEC, they removed aggregate limits. That means while there's a limit on a candidate, there's no limit on the total number of candidates you bankroll. In the dissenting opinion, Justice Breyer, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan, not related, I don't think, to our senator, they dissented and they argued that the decision creates a loophole, and I'm quoting, creates a loophole that will allow a single individual to contribute millions of dollars to a political party or to a candidate's campaign. Taken together, and this is the McCutcheon, the second case I mentioned, taken together with Citizens United, today's decision eviscerates our nation's campaign finance laws, leaving a remnant incapable of dealing with the grave problems of democratic legitimacy that those laws were intended to resolve. You know, obviously they're Supreme Court judges, they can say it a hell of a lot better than I can. But I think that, in a nutshell, says it. It overturned, you know, McCain-Feingold, a bipartisan piece of legislation, or part of McCain-Feingold, overturned a piece of bipartisan legislation to put some limits to ensure that the contributions and voice of Joe and Mary, everyday voters, don't get drowned out. When we see elections of millions and billions of dollars, primarily coming from the corporate sector, the voices of everyday citizens are simply not being heard. They're getting drowned out. I mean, if you do a media buy of $3 or $5 million in Maryland or a $50 million buy nationally of a 30-second ad or 60-second ad, that's what people will see. And I wish we had more public debates. I wish we had public financing of elections. I wish we had other elements in our quiver to encourage broad public engagement in elections. But the fact is, a lot of it depends on television. And television depends on money. And we are told that those decisions were about free speech. It means if you've got the money, you've got the speech. That is the center of what SJ1 deals with. We don't see, at least for a few more years, at least for 2 more years, Congress taking any action. Changes in Congress could bring action, but we're not betting the house on that. This could be revisited by the Supreme Court, but we don't expect a change on the current Supreme Court. What Senate Joint Resolution 1 tries to do is initiate and expand the public conversation, the public dialogue about the role of big money in politics. I think it's offensive. I think it's wrong. I think the Supreme Court was wrong. President Obama said it was wrong. In his, I think, State of the Union a week later, he said it was wrong. But the fact is, it is the law of the land. And we have groups and organizations, and we can get into Koch brothers and others, who are investing hundreds of millions of dollars. There's a great book Jane Mayer wrote, Dark Money. You should read. It's all documented. It's not assertion. It is documented with numbers. This bill specifically calls for a constitutional convention. Why? Because there are very few outlets to reverse Citizens United. Do we know what will happen in a constitutional convention? No, there hasn't been one in this country. There are some people concerned what happens at a constitutional convention. We don't know. But a number of states have said, we want to begin this dialogue of calling for reversal of Citizens United. And what this does, this bill would bring Maryland into that conversation. It would say, Maryland believes we have to pursue whatever effort is available to us to expand that conversation. It's not an unlimited call for this constitutional convention. It creates a window. It says if it doesn't happen in 8 years, then this goes away. Will enough states approve this in the next 8 years? I don't know. I'm not sure, if I were a betting man, where I'd place my bet on that. But the fact is, I think we have to have that conversation here in Maryland about big money and the role it has on politics, and I think that's a negative effect. Now, there are some who say, I get nervous about the thing called a constitutional convention. They could take up other issues. I heard one person say, you pull these people together from the state, they might not only reverse Citizens United, they might try to reverse the Bill of Rights. You know, I don't think that'll happen, but even if we're concerned about that, the state legislature can always reverse or rescind their call for a constitutional convention. I wish we didn't have to go this route. I wish we had Congress that would just simply reverse it and pass that, and we'd solve this and move forward. But the fact is, we don't have that ease at the moment. Maybe we will in the future years. So that's why I've introduced Senate Joint Resolution 1. And there are a number of people behind me who are going to talk about different aspects of it and the role they play. So with that, thank you for consideration, and I'm going to return, and then we can move to the next speaker.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Thank you so much for your sponsorship of this bill. And I'm Charlie Cooper, president of Get Money Out, an all-volunteer group here in Maryland. Been working for 6 years on this. And we're just thrilled to have this opportunity, and with the way there's a lot of new committee members, and you've welcomed us into your offices, and thank you very much. And we have supporters here. Just briefly, with the supporters of this bill, please stand up. Thank you for coming.
Quite as many as the dentist yesterday, but a great turnout. Thank you all.
Okay, so Citizens United was decided on the basis that the senator said, but there are actually a whole string of decisions, and what we have now is the era of the billionaire. It evolved. And 9 years after the Citizens United decision, it's a disaster for just about every citizen. So in your packet, just below Representative Raskin's testimony, you have Representative Raskin's testimony on top. And he, by the way, he's on the Judiciary Committee as on the subcommittee on the Constitution. So on the question of whether we're doing something dangerous, I think he's an authority you ought to listen to. But under that, you have our exhibits. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and the next speakers will talk a little bit about our exhibits. So now, in 2010, the year of the decision, the 100 top individual donors contributed $73 million in various ways to influence campaigns. By 2016, that was $900 million. 73 million, 900 million. And this past year in Florida, the U.S. Senate race, $209 million. $95 million didn't go through a candidate committee. It went through super PACs. In Exhibit A on our page, it just looks at midterms. And in the 2018 midterm, $5.7 billion spent. There's a typo in my written, but it's 50% increase over 2014. Then the next chart, Exhibit B, is the outside spending.
Folks, looks like this in your file. It's got various charts and exhibits.
So 5.7 billion, up 50% over 4 years ago. And then the outside spending, 1.3 billion, up 138%. They're not finished. You know, if we wait 8 years, these numbers are going to be totally astronomical. So one of the implications of this is anybody who wants to run for one of these offices has to run like hell every single day to raise money, because the outside committees are raising money, and then I have money in my campaign. And so they spend time hobnobbing with people who can give the maximum amount, and they don't have any time to talk to average citizens. You know, in fact, John Sarbanes tells us they don't come to the committee hearings because they got to be in the cubicle making the phone calls. Now, when our election system is swamped this way with money from financial elites and wealthy ideologues, and sometimes even foreign governments and businesses, the result is that all the laws are tilted towards their interests. Tax law, labor law, financial regulations, the whole gamut. So the average citizen might be a voter, or they might be so fed up they're not voting anymore. But 96% of them in a recent Washington Post, University of Maryland poll blame money for dysfunction in our political system. Now, tell me about another issue that there's this much consensus on in the United States. And then more recently, the Center for Public Integrity found that 3/4 of survey respondents, they surveyed something like 10,000 people, I believe. 3/4 of respondents, including 66% of Republicans and 85% of Democrats, back a constitutional amendment outlawing Citizens United. So what we're asking you to do is do the most powerful thing you can do by supporting this resolution, and Ms. Sheila Ruth will continue for us.
Chair Pinsky and members of the committee, thank you for having me. My name is Sheila Ruth, and I'm a resident of District 44 and a board member of Get Money Out Maryland. We live in a time of unprecedented and growing income inequality. The super rich are dealing with the serious issue of how to keep their priceless artwork safe on their super yachts. True story. Meanwhile, 38% of Maryland households don't earn enough for the basic cost of living, according to the latest Alice report. This includes 47% of households in Baltimore City and 56% of households in Somerset County, unable to meet their basic needs. Exhibit G in your packet shows how the wealth of the richest 5% is growing, while the wealth of the bottom 90% is declining. The top 1% have more wealth than the bottom 90%. But super yachts and private and priceless art aren't the only things that extreme wealth can buy. Billionaires can also use their wealth to influence policy to a high degree. A 2014 Princeton study by Martin Gylens and Benjamin Page found that the influence the average American has over policy is minuscule, while the wealthy have a large influence. Needless to say, policies that protect and expand their wealth are very popular with the wealthy. So we have a vicious cycle where the rich get richer and more wealth gives them more political power. A few $1 million of campaign spending can net billions, a pretty good return on investment. Citizens United v. FEC exacerbated the situation by opening the floodgates to unlimited money being spent on elections. But long before Citizens United, another Supreme Court decision, Buckley v. Vallejo, began the process of dismantling the government's ability to regulate campaign finance. Exhibit D in your packet shows the share of U.S. income that goes to the top 0.1%. You can see that the line starts trending upwards in the late 1970s. Interestingly, that correlates to the Buckley decision in 1976. We can't definitively conclude causation, but it does seem likely that loosening the rules governing campaign spending allowed the wealthy greater power to tilt the laws increasingly in their favor. I ask you to please take this important step toward restoring our democracy and find favorable for SJ1, the Democracy Amendment Resolution. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I'm Hank Pinsky of Tacoma Park. I'm a citizen lobbyist. For the past 6 years, I've been working here to amend the Constitution of the United States, to overrule the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United, to end the corrupting influence of big money in our elections. This legislation before you, the Democracy Amendment Resolution, has a simple goal. It would allow the states and the federal government to regulate the raising and spending of money in our elections. Period. That's all. But why is it necessary to amend the Constitution? Because in a long series of decisions by the Supreme Court, Citizens United versus FEC, Buckley versus Vallejo, McCutcheon versus FEC, the court has systematically removed all limits on corporate, union, and nonprofit spending to influence our elections. All limits. Even Maryland's former limits on aggregate campaign contributions have been deleted from our state law. The current Supreme Court is not about to change its interpretation of the personhood rights of corporations. We are not about to get a more balanced Supreme Court, not for at least another generation. According to our U.S. Senator, Chris Van Hollen, and I quote, "I believe that a convention is warranted only in the narrowest of circumstances, where there is a pressing matter of supreme national importance, and where that matter is not likely to be resolved through an act of Congress. This test has been met in this case. Citizens United decision is already harming our democracy, but there is little chance of congressional action with the current composition of the U.S. Senate and House," end quote. And here's the assessment from the original author of the Democracy Amendment Resolution, your former colleague in this state Senate, my current Congressman, Jamie Raskin, and I quote, "There remains a dire threat to our democracy in the form of the unmitigated flow of corporate money into the electoral system in the wake of Citizens United. The electoral arena is no longer a place of political equality and freedom for all our citizens. The playing field is now tilted in the favor of major corporations, special interest groups, and the vastly wealthy," end quote. He goes on to speak of your role as being the only people who can actually amend the Constitution. It is the state legislatures that can, based on Article 5, call for an amendment proposing convention. And it is the state legislatures that ultimately are the only ones who can ratify any amendments to the Constitution. He concludes, and I quote, "Democracy Amendment Resolution calls for a convention to propose an amendment on campaign finance. Despite the fears being promulgated of a runaway convention,
Every such amendment must be ratified by 3/4, 38 states. Simply put, 13 legislative bodies in any 13 states can refuse to ratify an amendment. I know that calling for the convention is unorthodox, though it's happened many times before, but with the political gridlock in Washington, the states advance the nation by thinking and acting as constitutional actors and citizens.
Mr. President,
Perhaps
we'll have to
then,
wrap it up.
and only then, will Congress retake the mantle of pursuing the amendment process. Thank you for your consideration of this democracy amendment resolution, and happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you. Next, please.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Pinsky and committee members, for allowing us to be here today. And thank you, Chairman Pinsky, for your leadership over the years on this important legislation. My name is Michael Moneta. I am the National Director for Wolfpack. We are a nonpartisan organization working to add an amendment to the U.S. Constitution that will address our broken campaign finance system. I'm proud to be here today with so many amazing Maryland citizens who are engaged in the democratic process, some of them for the very first time. And I'd like to just take a moment and acknowledge Charlie, Susan, Hank, everyone at the Get Money Out Maryland, all volunteer organization for their incredible dedication to this cause over the last five years now. Just inspiring. And this is how the Constitution is supposed to be amended. It's supposed to be citizens standing up together and demanding change when they see a need. And we're all here today to take responsibility for fixing something that frankly should have been fixed a long time ago. The amount of money pouring into our federal elections, often with little or no transparency, is out of control. And the hard truth is that it's only gotten worse year after year for decades, no matter which party was in power. So this legislation gives us an opportunity to come together as a nation to find a solution that has to be so popular, so bipartisan, so universally accepted, if it has any chance of being approved by 3/4 of our state governments and becoming part of our Constitution. That's what we know for sure about the way that our Constitution is designed. So here are just a few quick things to know about this legislation. Number one, the majority of all U.S. constitutional amendments have included a convention campaign from the states, going all the way back to the Bill of Rights. Passing applications just like SJ1 is a proven strategy for achieving constitutional change when Congress has been unwilling or unable to act. Number two, there is a difference between peer-reviewed research and op-eds. 100% of the peer-reviewed research conducted on this subject have concluded that there are checks on a convention process and fears of a so-called runaway convention are unfounded. That's from the Department of Justice under both Jimmy Carter and Reagan, 4 reports from the Congressional Research Service, the American Bar Association, Harvard Law Review, Rotunda Constitutional Law Textbook, and the list goes on. We provided those quotes to you in the packets that I left at your offices. In closing, I'd just like you to remember that every generation of Americans has had their own issues to solve, some bigger than this one. But this is ours. It is our generation's greatest duty to solve this problem and leave our country and our government in a better place than we found it. And what this resolution does at its core is it forces a national conversation on campaign finance reform. It's a conversation that we absolutely must have if we're going to survive as a democratic republic. It is that serious. Okay, last sentence. I strongly urge you to vote yes on SJ1 and also to prioritize this important legislation in the 2019 session so that Maryland can establish itself as a leader in the biggest fight of our generation. Thank you.
That might have been a little bit of a run-on sentence, but we'll give you credit for that. Thank you. Next, ma'am.
Thank you, Chairman Pinsky. And greetings on this Love of Democracy Day. My name is Argentine Craig, and I live in District 43 in the city. And I've lived in that district for 46 years. I am a retired professor of the Applied Behavioral Sciences, working at universities here in Maryland, and also at American University, and at the University of Vermont, and at the last one was the University of California and Santa Barbara. I have been an activist in Baltimore, Maryland, for at least 20 years, working with community organizations and fighting for the issues of social justice, diversity, and inclusion with groups like the Baltimore Ethical Society, the League of Women Voters, and now Get Money Out. I am a member of the community of activists. Today I'm here to speaking for myself, to show my support for the Democracy Amendment Resolution, and to ask for its favorable vote and passage. Minorities are disproportionately impacted by big money in our political system, by large social, environmental, and economic justice issues are not represented by the donor class. The 2017 tax bill benefits the ultra-wealthy, show the influence of wealthy donors on Congress. Race intersects with America's big money campaign funding system in many important ways. The overwhelmingly white donor class has preferences that diverge significantly from those of people of color. The role of money in politics greatly compounds the problems of political inequality. Money in politics makes it that such harder for people of color to exert political power and effectively advocate for their interests, as both wealth and power are consolidated by a small, very white share of the population. People of color have difficulty getting started as candidates because the financial barriers that they encounter. The money primary eliminates them sometimes before they even get started. And I draw your attention to Exhibit H.
Ms. Craig, you're going to have to bring
Speed it
to...
up? All right. Thank you. Thank you.
No, you can take a last sentence or a paragraph.
All right, I
For your
will.
conclusion.
All right, in conclusion, it is a little discouraging that many of the national organizations working for a constitutional amendment that we greatly need are merely asking Congress to do it. Of course, that must be done too, and it is being done, but we have to do something more to leverage our power as citizens in the state of Maryland. Our ability to speak to you here today is testament to the value of working for an amendment through our state legislatures. So, it gives me great hope that you have formidable power granted to you by the U.S. Constitution of 1789 to include the amendment process. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Tidwell, you're still on the first panel, just in time.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I was across the street testifying on an energy bill.
You must have ran with the wind.
I did. I ran with the wind. I really appreciate this opportunity to just add on to what I'm sure were great arguments made already by the panel. But I would just say, as you know, Senator Pinsky, I represent the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. We have 29,000 supporters across the state of Maryland, and we promote wind and solar power and solutions to climate change. I spend a lot of time in church basements and school cafeterias talking about the issues of climate and clean energy, and there's overwhelming support for clean energy in the state. The polling data shows it. But after I go all over the state talking about these issues, I will visit some of the fundraisers for some of our legislators here in Annapolis, and you can be at Harry Brown's and elsewhere, and you can just see the representatives of the utilities and the American Petroleum Institute and others literally with a scorecard in their pocket of all the fundraisers they're going to, checking them off with checks in their pockets, right, in their pockets. And everybody who knows Annapolis has seen it. And those same people in those church basements in Garrett County can't come to Annapolis and write a check to those legislators. And if corporations or individuals then those people in Garrett County in those church basements don't have the same voice, and everyone knows it, which is why we do have to get money out of politics. I will say on the federal level, it's even worse of a problem. We know that. ExxonMobil and other corporations have denied climate change. Their own internal science has showed that they've been lying to their shareholders and lying to the public, and they are able to get away with that by, again, handing out the checks to legislators and circumventing the voice of average Americans who are going to pay the price on climate change. So I'm happy to be here representing an actual group that advocates for something that is very popular in our state, wind and solar and solutions to climate change, and we are affected by the unlimited amount of money that corporations, fossil fuel industries can give. And the last example I'll give is the fracking ban. It took us 7 years to pass a ban on fracking in our state, and that's because we had to constantly fight against the virtually unlimited checks of the fossil fuel industry. And the year we passed it, finally, in 2017, was one of the biggest mass movements, grassroots movements in the history of the state. American Petroleum Institute spent $1.5 million trying to stop us. It was more than any other industry spent on any advocacy issue in Annapolis, and it took us 7 years to finally overcome them. It shouldn't be that way, so I think this is a great bill, and I thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tidwell. Questions for this panel? Questions for this panel? Start with Senator Gallion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate a few members of your group that stopped by the other day, and we had a nice discussion. There was a talk, a kind of a theme that there's a concern about the power of a few that really affect so much. One issue that's been talked about a little also is the concern of a possible runaway convention. But when I met with you all the other day, you seemed to say it would be a one-issue thing. So this couldn't become a thing where all kinds of stuff, is that correct? Is that your understanding? Okay.
Senator Gallion, we're going to have an expert in the next panel who has just devoted himself to studying this and has read everything on this topic, Sam Feldman. But yes, we believe, and there's 7 or 8 reports in your packet from official sources that say that there are methods of restricting it.
Yeah,
it isn't automatically restricted, just like we're not automatically getting this passed. The people will have to work on it if it should come to pass. But what we're hoping, too, is that when the Congress sees these petitions coming from the states for an amendments convention, and when they see that 75% of the people support an amendment, they'll eventually get the message. But if the states don't act, it relieves that pressure.
Right.
Thank you.
And Senator, one thing in the bill that Senator Pinsky has presented says that any delegates from the state of Maryland are restricted in what they're going to discuss, and they are prevented from voting on any amendment other than one for the specific purpose of regulating the raising and spending of money in our elections.
Right, thank you. And from our discussion the other day, I also brought up to you some of my issues that I had with this. But as you're looking at the power of the few determining what's going on for so many people, and I mentioned this to you, to me, convention for term limits. We have so many people that just get reelected so many times. There's so much power concentrated in so few. To me, that would actually, I think, be a higher priority even than this one. And also the other thing that I have concerns is our runaway. I just heard the other day we're at $22 trillion in our national debt. I'd love to see a balanced budget amendment at the federal level so they have to do what state government does, but I realize that's not the issue you're concerned. But I appreciate you discussing that with me the other day when we met about that. So those are just a few things that I wanted to bring up, and I think that's all I had for right now.
Thank you. Senator Lamb.
For your testimony. Appreciate all of that. And I know many of you have met me as well to discuss some of this, and I'm very sympathetic to the concerns about all of the money that's currently being spent in our political system. My question is actually for Mr. Mineta, and specifically about Wolfpack. And I'm trying to get a better understanding of what Wolfpack's intent and mission is in all of this, because I'm guessing you've probably met with most of the folks in the committee. can you speak to a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we have only one goal, and that is to get an amendment that's going to solve this problem. And we specifically don't write the amendment. I think that's the main point here, and the reason that we have been able to get strong bipartisan support across the country is that we really are forcing the conversation around this issue, which is all a convention is at the end of the day. If we can actually get to a convention, and that's a really big if. It's been 200 and something years, and we have not had a convention yet. So it's going to ultimately be up to Congress to give up this monopoly they've had on proposing amendments for this long. So it's a pretty big ask, and we feel that it's just absolutely essential that the states are using this tool to expand the conversation, as Chairman Pinsky had pointed out. That's it. We don't do anything else. This is our only focus, is to go and talk to state governments and explain the importance of this. And just to expand, I guess, on the last question, there are 5 state governments so far that have taken this step. And there are other organizations, some conservative leaning, that have been pushing for a balanced budget amendment through a convention for 50 years. They may get, but you need to get to 34 on one issue. Because, and we know that for multiple reasons. I can get into that if you want, or Sam can. But, yeah, we feel if we don't force this conversation, we're going to be in trouble. And we feel the convention needs to be where the amendment is deliberated. So we're talking about a conversation about this issue with the knowledge that anything proposed needs to be approved by 75% of our state governments afterwards, ensuring that it's going to be common sense, logical, popular,
Sure.
Bipartisan, all that.
So, and I think that brings up an important point, which is getting at people's intent and what they're trying to do in their motivations. And so, and I think that's obviously kind of the underpinnings of why we're having this discussion now with the money that's going into our political system. And so I ask you, as someone who leads Wolfpack, have you spent money here in Maryland?
Spent money in elections, we have.
In elections
yes.
here in Maryland.
Yep.
So for an organization like Wolfpack, whose intent is to get money out of elections, how do you square that circle?
Well, because it's a political reality. And that's what, a lot of times we found that some politicians are responsive to, right? And this is the world that we live in. So our goal is to make doing that, not possible for a super PAC. But we're going to use, I guess our position is we're going to use all the tools available to correct the system. Until it's fixed, we're not going to, just leave things on the table. We feel it's that urgent. We feel this. I mean, every issue that we care about ties back to this. Whether it's, the environment on the left or fiscal responsibility on the right, it's all any progress on everything is being stopped on this. So we believe it's extremely urgent, and we have to do everything we can to get this done. And if it involves running some elections, yeah, we will do that. And we've ran some negative and we've ran some positive. We love to help out our supporters. We need good people that support us in office. So it's just part of what we do as a super PAC.
Mm-hmm. So, Common Cause shared this article that cited $50,000 being spent on a former member of this committee.
Yep.
And, we went, and it's been brought to our attention from folks that have shared some of the campaign finance reports that came from the State Board of Elections, that in looking back at the last cycle, that much of this money came from just a few individual people. Like, looking back at this report that was shared with us, 6 $1,000 contributions from one employee at Google, another 18 $2,000 contributions from the same employee at Google, $20,000 from the Young Turks, and then $10,000 from one individual from a hedge fund.
No.
Is that what helps support this?
No. That's part of our donations, but that's far less than 1% is what was just quoted there. So the money that we got from TYT Network was like 7 years ago. So that was spent about 7 years ago.
Then why is it appearing in this campaign finance report?
I am not because it's probably because you have to report your largest donations. Maybe it's the TYT may have been within that period, whatever it is, 3 or 4 years. But it's not
a set campaign finance period that it's citing, right? It's for a set period of, I think it was a couple months.
Yes, so you have to report your largest donor. So that's what that is. But just to clarify, like where our funding comes from, if you do the math, it's over 99% comes from people paying less than $200. So less than $200 donations. We get.
You're talking about nationally.
That's what we used.
Overall.
We used our that's right, our national
what's
fund.
What's filed with the State Board of Elections is what I just said.
But what I'm saying is, because part of the requirement when you file is you have to release all of your biggest donations. So the $1,000 ones that are quoted there are people that actually pay $1,000 a month. Yes, a couple of Google employees. But that goes into our bank account. They didn't just give that money for that election. That goes into our bank account, and it's literally 99.9, I think, or it's over 99% of our funding comes from people who pay less than, it's for each donation is less than $200. So as far as the big donations, yeah, we've gotten a couple. But I mean, what you saw there, what you cited there is extreme minority of where our money comes from.
Okay, well, I'm just reading off of what's been filed with the State Board of Elections. I know my colleague on this committee, just in prior questioning, cited concerns about the power of the few. And so, how do you not see the irony in that, in how you're spending through Wolfpack? That it's really kind of the power of the few that are really fueling, your work.
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, we get that there's irony in that. Absolutely. Yeah. I won't deny that. But again, for us, it comes back to just a political reality. It's how this system is set up to work right now, and so we feel that it has to be part of what we do if we're going to get this done. So get involved in some elections. We don't do it very often.
I think we've covered that.
Right.
I think
okay.
You've answered
so
that.
Just one final closing. So, I guess in light of all of that, I do find that ironic. I do find it concerning, and particularly as a member of this committee, where a former member of this committee have been targeted as well, potentially just for that vote. This is a press release that you put out yourself out of Wolfpack. Maybe very proud of that work that you've done to unseat that individual. But I am concerned about it, and I would express, again, my concern is regarding this. I am very sympathetic to, getting money out of politics, and I think we do need to step up and continue to encourage that as well. So. Let me close with that. Isn't that so?
Yeah, and can I just say, I'd be happy to clarify that, offline as far as some of those numbers, because I'm not exactly sure what you're looking at. So
please do. Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for testimony. I apologize. I had to step out for a bit, so forgive me if what I'm going to bring up was asked earlier. Quite a bit of groups that support minority rights and so many rights that have been hard fought over the years, many years in our American democracy, are afraid of conventions like this because of the potential unruly nature of it. And the chairman mentioned that in his testimony. And religious minorities, racial minorities, union groups. And then I read the text of the resolution on page 2, line 8 and 9. It says, whereas the state of Maryland intends to retain the ability to restrict or expand the power of its delegates within the limits expressed above. And so why not just limit the call for this resolution to exactly this? Why put in we can restrict or expand the powers of this? And I think this kind of line kind of fuels the anxiety that so many groups have with this process. How would you address that?
Senator Ellis, we would be glad to strike or expand at that point, and we have no difficulty with that. And I just would also direct you to further down on line 24, resolved. So the resolved section is in some ways more authoritative than the whereas section.
Okay.
That delegates to the Convention for Maryland may not propose or support amendments that do not have the primary goals of addressing only the specific and limited purpose enumerated above. Okay, so one of the things that we want to say is that this campaign, which our group has no funding from anybody except our members that might buy a T-shirt or something, or just pay the costs ourselves. And we've been fighting for this 6 years. We've we've identified 8,000 supporters. And that's what's really carried this to this point where it did pass the House last year, it passed this Senate in 2015. And we believe that the focusing on the risks of the convention or on the question of whether we can be guaranteed about a convention, I believe we're guaranteed that if we leave billionaires with this much influence in our elections, and if we leave Exxon to take the money you buy gas with and spend it against you in the election, against your interests, I believe we are guaranteed that our country is going to descend further and further into inequality and strife. Whereas the convention may happen, it may not happen, and Congress may propose the amendment. We're going to tell you a story in the next panel about a time when this kind of campaign forced Congress to propose an amendment that it resisted proposing for decades.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up on my colleague, my friend from Charles County brought, also on line 24, I'll just read the line, resolve that delegates to the convention from Maryland may not propose or support amendments that do not have the primary goals. I think if you change that may to a shall would help also.
Yeah, that would be fine. No problem with that. Whichever more strongly binds the convention delegates is fine with us.
Just spoke with committee counsel. When it's written as may not, it translates to shall not in terms of the annotated code and the interpretation of the words.
So it's already shall not.
Right. That concludes this panel. Thank all of you for your patience and contribution. We're going to go to the second and last panel of the proponents. Then we'll move to the opponents. Let's have Donna Sauerberger, Renaud Brown, Sam Fieldman, Michelle Kuhl, Ashley Sparks, and Susan Ogden. I think we have enough seats. And then we'll go to the opposition. Callie Shumitz, Nancy Saran, David Whitney, Janice Ford, Damon Effingham, Terry Kavanaugh, and Cindy Smalls.
Hello, excuse me. My name is Donna Sauerberger from Gambrills, Maryland, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to address this committee, and thank you for your sponsorship. In my written testimony and in other presenters, we've heard about how widespread and deep is the desire to overcome the dark money and other results of the Citizens United decision. And so for my time here this afternoon, I just want to focus on how the heck are we going to get this done? Excuse me. I think it's pretty clear that the many legislators share our concern about how the Supreme Court decision has impacted our political system and how we can overcome it. President Obama said that the decision has caused, quote, great harm to our democracy, and it's time to reverse this trend. And goodness knows the legislators have done their best. They worked very hard to try to get this done. A lot of the people who are working on it, have been working on it, are from Maryland, I'm very proud to say. In 2010, Representative Chris Van Hollen was a prime sponsor of the Disclose Act that would have mostly fixed one aspect of the problem. In 2014, Senate Democrats held a hearing on a constitutional amendment to limit campaign spending, with Jamie Raskin being one of the two witnesses for the proposition. But even though the Democrats controlled the Senate, they couldn't get the votes, so nothing was done in the Senate, and the House of Representatives has not fared any better. They couldn't even get a committee hearing on an amendment resolution until now. Today's bill may address it, but it's far from having the votes needed to do it. So they've given it their all, and will continue to try, and maybe a miracle will happen, and a government that can't really tie its own shoes right now will step up and work together and get this done. So until then, when people urge us not to pursue this amendment convention and wait until the legislators fix the problem, I despair. Because the will is there, the will is definitely there, and they've done their best for 9 years and will hopefully continue. But this partisan, dysfunctional government, I don't think has the ability to do it. So I ask that you, our state government representatives, please do what cannot be done by our national government, and on behalf of your constituents, help deliver us from the devastating effects of Citizens United by supporting this bill.
Thank you. Next, whoever chooses to, don't be bashful. Somebody.
My name is Renaud Brown. Why I'm here actually doing this work. There were 2 movies prior to me doing this work 5 years ago. One's called The Inside Trader, I think. It was a 2008 movie. And the other was Koch Brothers Exposed, which I saw during the summer of 2014. And that has led me to 3 of our supporters in this group. And also, I was looking at the exhibits that you have in your packets, and Exhibit H and I would also apply to me. Congress has been corrupted and stands in the way of the constitutional amendment we need to restore our democratic republic. So, to give you an example, we have the 17th Amendment that gave us the direct election of senators. The first 225 years of our democracy, senators were appointed so they can have a majority in the Senate, and because these senators were giving literally bags of money, and it sort of relates to the Congress that we see now. And so as a result, the people are the ones that really want this. 96% of the people want this, and the states have the power to control it. And I ask that we as Maryland be the 6th state and pass favorably SJ1. Thank you.
Sam.
Sorry. Thank you. My name is Sam Fieldman, and I'd like to first reiterate something that Mike Mineta said. It may surprise you to hear that there's actually no debate on the Article 5 convention process in the professional literature. And when I say that, it doesn't come from a quick research assignment by well-meaning and admirable, but ultimately small staff with dozens of areas of laws on which to opine. I've been studying this issue for 9 years now. And I've read, you've got in your packets about 300 pages of material of the most well-respected institutional and governmental sources. I've read every page of that. I've read the thousands of pages of sources that they cite. And that's why I've written for you a short summary of the state of the research on this topic, which cites all of that. It's available electronically. There's a URL at the top of the written version that I've given you. And because I've spent so much time on this, I've been able to go deeper than a lot of the other people who've looked into it. When I see a source, I call up the source, find out if I'm understanding it correctly, which is why when the Attorney General's office in Maryland understandably misread a source from a 2016 law student because it was worded a little confusingly, I emailed him and called him up and have got a statement here from him saying that he was mischaracterized. We find time and again that if you look at the context of every statement about this issue, you'll find all of the peer-reviewed sources agree. And you find op-eds cited frequently, and you find out-of-context statements cited frequently, You might hear statements from Lawrence Tribe opposing the Article 5 convention, when in fact he said, I would also object very much to someone who said that because I don't know the answers to all the questions about an Article 5 convention, I would oppose ever having one, and that's why I made it very clear that I don't take that view. You might hear quotes from Antonin Scalia saying he opposed the convention, when in fact he compared the idea of a runaway convention to the idea of Congress canceling Christmas. And I'm sorry that Senator Lamb has stepped out, but I hope that someone will, I hope that he'll share that report with us. I'd be happy to look at it in more detail and respond in detail to anything that's written in there. But I would hope that the same treatment is given also to Common Cause, who sent him that report, because they have not released a single name of any of their donors since 2013. They released redacted reports of the $1.5 million they were given last year, the $600,000 they were given last year. I have no idea who's funding them, but the last time they were funded, well, that report's no longer on their website. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fieldman. Next.
Thank you, Chairman Pinsky and members of the committee. The speakers here have done a really good job talking about the runaway convention idea. I'm new to all this. I went ahead and researched it. I've heard about this idea, and I'm firmly convinced that the requirement that amendments must be ratified by a supermajority of 3/4 of all the states is a significant enough safeguard, as Senator Van Hollen has written in his testimony.
Let me interrupt. For
Sure.
the record, because it's
Sure.
streamed, could you give your name?
Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped. Michelle Cowell. I live in District 33. Thanks. The second idea with that is that history has shown us that it's unlikely that the Article 5 convention would even happen, as it's more likely that congressional leaders will decide to take action themselves as the states begin to pressure Congress. Congress will act to head off the convention and keep the power to draft the language of an amendment in their own hands. And I believe that the timing cannot be better to exert this kind of peer pressure. I'd like to use the rest of my time to speak to you on what brings me here, testifying on legislation for the very first time. 2 years ago, I joined an advocacy group called WISE, consisting of over 700 women from Anne Arundel County. One of my tasks this past election cycle was to use the campaign reporting database to characterize candidates' campaign donations and share that information with voters. The detrimental effect of Citizens United can be observed at the local level, where the dollar amounts are rising. We had some newcomers to the political scene in our district, and what I found is that they were ultimately outspent by more than 4-to-1 by the incumbents. I was also naively shocked to see how much of the donations came from businesses, as much as 40% of total campaign dollars. In our county, overdevelopment is a very hot topic. For a particular race, I calculated that at a minimum, 1 out of every $5 of donation money was coming from development-related businesses or employees thereof. There are a multitude of studies showing that no matter how we try to act independently, despite gifts like campaign donations, we are beholden to the gift giver. Corporations know this. We should be turning away business donations rather than treating them as speech. In conclusion, I want to mention that I'm a mechanical engineering professor of 19 years. When I talk to my students about structural failure, I tell them to be sure that they address the root cause of the failure, as it's the most effective way to solve the problem. That's why I'm here. There are so many things I want to see fixed in our current government, and I view money in our politics as a root cause of failure. The voices of truly unbiased experts and our citizens are drowned out by the money that's allowed to pour in. I'm here today to respectfully ask you to support this resolution to address this root cause of failure in our democracy. Thank you.
Either Ms. Ogden or Ms. Sparks.
My name is Ashley Sparks, and I recently graduated with a master's degree from Boston University, and I'm currently living and teaching in Charles County. I'm here today because I support the passage of the Democracy Amendment Resolution, and I ask for your favorable vote. As a millennial, it is me and my generation that will be living for many decades with the ramification of the action or inaction demonstrated today. We need reform from our present money-based election system. I ask you to acknowledge that our system is broken and in the hands of a small number of wealthy elites whose interests do not address the growing problems in this country, such as the student loan crisis, a living wage, the opioid epidemic, gun reform, affordable health care, just to name a few. The opposition to this bill is based on hypothetical fears, but I'm here to tell you the pain being experienced by my generation is far from a fantasy. About 40% of college students in this country are facing food insecurity, and I know because I was one of them. The influence of money in politics took $1.5 trillion that could have erased all student loan debt, but instead gave it to the richest among us. Previous generations speak of an American dream, but that is nothing but a fairy tale to millennials and the generations coming up behind us. Money in our elections is a present threat, not an imaginary one. So instead of dwelling on fears of what could happen, here are 5 things that will happen if you pass the Democracy Amendment resolution. 1, the bill in a letter is sent to Congress where it will join the list of memorials that include calls for overturning Citizens United from 5 other states, Vermont, California, Illinois, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. 2, Maryland will demonstrate leadership where Congress won't, and inspire action in other states like Massachusetts, Wyoming, New Hampshire, and several others. 3, since 96% of citizens, which include independents, Republicans, and Democrats, are disgusted with corruption, the citizens in your districts will thank you for taking a stand against Citizens United. 4, Maryland sends a message to Congress that calls for reform are growing. Let's be honest, Congress is slow to act, but as we get to 10, 15, 20 states on board, in our quest for 34, this movement will become impossible to ignore. That kind of national attention will put pressure on even this Congress to do something. 5, Maryland will join a movement that begins with citizens and their state representatives. I ask you to be brave leaders, to join a reform movement that stands with their citizens, to fight for a democracy that is truly by and for the people.
My name is Susan Ogden, and I am the Vice President of Get Money Out Maryland. I live in District 20. Every reform movement has factions and disagreements about the best way to achieve democratic change. This was true in the abolition movement, the civil rights movement, and the movement for women's suffrage. It's no less true in the move to reform our broken campaign finance system. Fear of the unknown and the untried is common, and it's paralyzing. Opponents of voting for women and African Americans warned of chaos and disaster. Opponents of the Democracy Amendment resolution often use the term Constitutional Convention and Article 5 Convention interchangeably. They are not the same thing. Article 5 calls for a convention to propose amendments, not a rewrite of the Constitution. Amendments which must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Opponents will tell you that calls can be aggregated, regardless of topic, to meet the threshold. According to the Office of the Clerk of the House, 147 applications for Article 5 conventions are active from 1960. No convention has been called in 231 years. Opponents will tell you that there are no rules or guidelines in the Constitution as to how a convention is transacted or delegates chosen. Our Constitution is a series of values and principles that form the basis of our laws. The other way of amending, 2/3 of both houses of Congress propose an amendment, is also short on procedural details. You will hear that Congress should establish rules before we have a convention. Were there to be a convention call, that's exactly what the people would demand and exactly what Congress would do. The United States is a nation of laws. We agree that for the cause of comity and intellectual integrity, we could say that we can find authorities debating both sides of this issue. The truth is, we're both talking about a hypothetical situation because it has not yet happened. It's an alternate way to amend that was given for a time when Congress should become oppressive. That time is now. Here's what's not hypothetical. In 1912, the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, was proposed by Congress when the states were one state short of the required number to call a convention. That's the model that moves us. Build a reform movement of citizens, state legislatures, put Congress on notice that our democracy is broken and we want it fixed. Thank you.
Panel, questions for this panel? Questions for this panel? Seeing none, thank you all for your
If I may I just repeat what I said concerning Senator Lamb since he is returned to the room?
On the side, we'll have a...
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for your contribution and your staying power. We're going to move to the opposition.
Mr. Chairman, I hope I successfully signed up, but I signed up as a non-panel supporter. My name is Patrick Enright.
I don't have you,
okay.
but
I hope I hit the wrong buttons.
Please come up. We'll add you.
I do have written testimony that you all have.
I'm sorry?
You do have written testimony
okay.
that I did submit as well. I'm sorry. I'll do better next time.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Patrick Enright. I'm here as an unpaid volunteer in support of Get Money Out. I'm here to dispel fear. I sense that legislators have a fear of participating in an amendment convention, number one, because of confusion. This is an amendment convention proposal, not a constitutional amendment proposal. President Lincoln wasn't afraid to support and prefer the amendment convention process because, as in my written testimony, I have an excerpt from his inaugural address which says he preferred this method because essentially he didn't trust Congress. Legislators are afraid of an exploding convention or a runaway convention. I remind you, it's the Congress of the United States, not a few states, that has the mandated power to convene such a convention. Not the states themselves, it's the Congress has the power, the many in the Congress. This is a tight resolution. This is the tightest I've seen of all of them that I've testified on. Maryland retains control of its participation, as was mentioned before, and there's proposals to tighten that. The resolution mandates a singular topic only, and that is part of the tightness of this resolution. So Maryland's participation, or not, during this process is pretty well defined. The General Assembly, you here have control over that participation, and that's a good thing. If 2/3 of the states approach that magic threshold to kick Congress into convening a convention, Congress has two options. They can convene it, or they can be afraid of what might happen in such a convention, because they will craft the parameters that control the conduct of the convention, and they may seize the day and present their own proposal. Or they may let the convention go, and it may go as a singular topic or one or two topics, and they come to the states. But I want you to know, as I end my testimony, in your legislative hearts and souls, you must understand that the General Assembly of the state, sovereign state of Maryland does not have to ratify anything. You have that control. It's not the few. It's the entire General Assembly of Maryland. You have that power. So my fear is that dark money, anonymous money, and now as I go home tonight and look at the news, the possibility of foreign money will be coming into our political process. Please, I implore you, give a favorable report and encourage your fellow senators on the floor to pass this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Enright.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're going to move to the opposition. Kelly Shumitz, Nancy Soren, Dave Whitney, Janice Ford, Damon Effingham, and if there are spots, Terry Kavanaugh and Cindy Smalls, or you can rotate in or out if we run out of chairs. And you may begin in whatever order you choose. Just start by, for the record, including your name.
Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
Or you can bring up another chair, whatever you want to do.
That's okay. I haven't. I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Pinsky and members of the committee, for allowing me to speak today. My name is Janice Ford, and I'm a retired teacher and a longtime resident of Howard County, and I'm testifying today in opposition to SJ1. I am here today because I have a serious health problem. I cannot get a good night's sleep. It seems like every week another one of my freedoms is under attack. My anxiety was only worsened as I became aware of Maryland's efforts to join the ranks of states calling for a constitutional convention. I realize some members of this Senate and other individuals have good intentions, and they desire only to find a solution for campaign finance abuses. But I have serious concerns about calling such a convention. Article 5 of our Constitution says a convention can be convened with 2/3 of the states in agreement. However, the Constitution provides no guidance whatsoever on ground rules for a convention, and I don't think anybody has been able to dispel that. There's no limit on the scope of the amendments that can be proposed, and no guarantees that the convention will be representative of all of our people. Who's going to choose the attendees? How many from each state will attend? Consider, if you will, this one little fact that I found out, that if each state should have one vote, The convention could approve an amendment with a simple majority vote. Remember, there are no rules. The 26 least populous states, which contain less than 18% of the nation's people, could approve an amendment for ratification. Now, speaking of the ratification process, the convention could choose a completely new ratification process. The original Constitutional Convention in 1787, people say there hasn't been one, there was one. It was in 1787. It went completely rogue. It was called for one issue, and they wound up coming up with our Bill of Rights. It would be very unwise to assume that the ratification of the convention proposals would necessarily require the approval of the 38 states, as the Constitution currently specifies. A convention could set its own agenda. You may say you're limiting the people. I don't know what you're going to do when they get into the convention and they choose not to, because you may not be the people who are appointing them to go. This could be Governor Hogan. There's no limit, there's nothing to limit it to just campaign finance abuses or a desire for a balanced budget. The special interest groups that have spent enormous amount of sums promoting this convention have their own agenda. Here's my concern for my loss of sleep. Any rights we currently enjoy could disappear. I dare say a woman's right to a safe and legal abortion would be in great jeopardy. How about the raising the vote?
Ms. Ford, you're going to have to wrap it up.
Okay, how about our voting age? We could raise that. Please, senators, I respectfully ask that you vote no on SJ1 so I can get a little more sleep.
Thank you, Chair Pinsky and members of the committee. My name is Callie Shumitz. I am the Director of Communications and Partner Engagement with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization. We work on a lot of different budget and tax issues, and we work on a lot of issues trying to reduce income inequality in Maryland and improve economic security for low-income working families. So we are very sympathetic to the intent behind this legislation. However, we first kind of got into the space of constitutional conventions around the proposal for a balanced budget amendment, which we have a lot of specific concerns about. It's touched on in our written testimony. Through that work, we learned of the significant risks of a constitutional convention. There are legal experts from across the spectrum, including a number of former Supreme Court justices, who have said a convention could write its own rules. A convention could set its own agenda, which is could potentially be influenced by the same special interest groups that are influencing our elections today. A convention could choose a new ratification process, and that no other body, including the courts, Congress, has clear authority over a convention. So that means if it starts straying from its intended purpose, there are no checks. That's why the General Assembly passed legislation in 2017 rescinding prior calls for constitutional conventions. We supported that legislation, and we think that reinstating a call for a constitutional convention for any reason is too risky, so we would ask for an unfavorable report. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nancy Soring, and I'm with the League of Women Voters of Maryland. The League of Women Voters is in complete agreement with the concerns of many of the people who testified before about the flood of money into politics. After 2 years of study and consensus about amending the Constitution, in 2016, the following position was announced. The League of Women Voters is concerned that there are many unresolved questions about the powers and processes of an Article 5 constitutional convention. Some of the things that we are concerned about were mentioned previously. How will the delegates be chosen? Will the convention be conducted in secret or in private? How will the voting take place? What will they discuss? With all of those questions out there, and with Congress having done nothing to address those, we strongly oppose taking on a constitutional convention until things are in place. I've often been asked, so what do we do in the meantime? Well, number one, the one thing that was left open in the Supreme Court decision was disclosure. There have been disclosure bills before this General Assembly that still have not been passed yet. you could act on those. There's also public campaign finance, which is another thing to combat big money in politics. And indeed, many politicians in Montgomery County were elected last year, and they ran against people that were well-funded, but they used public campaign financing. And then finally, before the House of Representatives right now is a bill called H.R. 1. H.R. 1, among its features, improves automatic voter registration, public financing of elections through small donating funds, and overturning Citizens United, as well as ending partisan gerrymandering. We believe this is the right way to improve democracy, and we're glad that at least Congress is beginning to act on it and beginning to take this up. Thank you. Therefore, we urge an unfavorable report.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Cindy Smalls, representing ASME. We are here testifying opposing SJ 1. While we agree with many of the good folks here who, again, want to get money out of politics, we as a union are not sure with all the testimony that this is the best way to do that. We understand their concerns, but we too as a union, I think we've seen a lot of money in politics, a lot of it used against unions, attacking us in court cases like ASME versus Janus versus ASME. We've seen those fights in Wisconsin from groups that say and have testified here today to say that they're one issue group, but we know that to be different in other states, that this, as they had mentioned, view this as an opportunity to get money out of politics, but we also view this as an opportunity to have maybe potential runaway convention that we're just not certain about what other issues that may come up. And some of those issues may be dealing with unions and duty of fair representation and a host of things that, that we feel are critical as union members. I would also like to say that, I mean, we've talked about a call for amendment or for a convention. I stand representing our International Executive Board of ASME. We've deliberated this issue and we've come down on a decision as a union that we just oppose because of the unknowns. Any call for amendments or a convention. I've talked to Charlie at Cooper at Get Money Out of Politics. You know, we made a commitment to continue talking, but at this time we feel that we would have to stay firm on our opposition to SJ1 and urge unfavorable reporting. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, my name is Damon Effingham, and I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause Maryland, an organization that's not hypocritical on the subject of participating in candidate elections, which is why we don't have State Board of Elections filings, because we don't participate in them. There's other specific misrepresentations that have been made here by Wolfpack today about the scholarly landscape and their work both here and across the country. I invite your questions about those. I also want to highlight that according to that testimony, there are significant concerns that they are improperly filing campaign finance reports, which should also lead you to question some of their intentions here. Supporters spent a good deal of time discussing the problems Citizens United has created, and we agree and support an amendment to the Constitution to fix this. But a constitutional convention is a dangerous and irresponsible path that in no way solves the problem. But you've already heard, and you have in your packets, numerous arguments about why this convention is dangerous. And to be clear, those concerns are not just from some people, but legal experts, election advocates, and Maryland's own Office of the Attorney General. And which is why the sponsor has been clear over the past few years that he also does not want a convention. Senator Pinsky has stated before this committee that he offers this resolution because he believes that passing it is necessary to start the conversation in the state and country about the impact of money in our politics. But in 2019, is that really the case? This January, the House majority passed H.R. 1, which included a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United and a public funding program for Congress. An unprecedented number of candidates ran openly refusing corporate PAC money. Maryland Congressman John Sarbanes, long a champion on these issues, is the architect of H.R. 1 and a leader of House efforts. Montgomery County just did their public funding program, and Republicans and Democrats participated. Howard, Prince George's, Baltimore City residents have enacted or enabled similar programs. A bipartisan group of council members in Baltimore County introduced such a program. Anne Arundel County is also exploring one. As an advocate, I can barely keep up with the explosion of interest. Similar programs have been enacted or proposed throughout the rest of the country. The conversation is underway. Are you listening? Wolfpack has argued that these conventions' calls help organize around the issue of money in politics, but public funding programs actually deliver on that promise by allowing for candidates with true support to build power and create a new way of doing business. These programs have spread rapidly, and as they have, champions, legislators who have spent actual political capital to truly change the landscape have risen as well. Representative Sarbanes is a perfect example of that, as is Senator Obie Patterson, who sits on this very committee. To sum up, we think that this is a dangerous call. We think that a true way to organize around this is already happening in Maryland. We invite you to join us to be a part of that, as opposed to a part of an organization strategy that apparently relies on getting large donations from rich white men in New Jersey to overdo a senator in Maryland, in Baltimore City, where they know nothing about. Thank you.
Mr. Whitney or Mr. Kavanaugh?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Senators, for this opportunity to testify before you. My name is Pastor David Whitney. I'm Senior Instructor at Institute on the Constitution, the only place in the world where you can study in an organized way this document that you have all sworn an oath to uphold, the Maryland Constitution. I want to show you from this Constitution why the runaway convention is guaranteed. Our Constitution begins, grateful to Almighty God for our civil and religious liberties, and then declares, Article 1 of the Declaration, that all government of right originates from the people, is founded in compact only, and instituted solely for the good of the whole, and they have at all times the inalienable right to alter, reform, or abolish their form of government in such manner as they may deem expedient. So when those delegates meet in convention, they can propose a brand new Constitution, not just amendments to the Constitution. And there's no way, once that convention begins to meet, that you can stop it. We do have history on this, and the history was in Philadelphia in 1787. They were told by every state that sent delegates, and only 12 states sent delegates, they were told by their state legislatures, you're only going to amend the Articles of Confederation. You can do nothing else. In fact, Massachusetts even instructed their delegates that there were certain things that they could not amend in the Articles of Confederation. And Rhode Island refused to send any delegates because they believed they held the trump card. That is, if they stayed out of the convention could not propose a brand new government because they knew the Articles of Confederation said all 13 states have to agree to any amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Well, obviously that didn't work. And when James Madison was challenged to say, hey, what, you guys, you violated your calling. You violated what you were about. He wrote in the Federalist Paper 40 in defense, he said the delegates invoke their transcendent and precious right to alter or abolish our form of government as recognized in the Declaration of Independence. So they could ignore the directions given to them. I think there's a better way than adding an amendment to the Constitution to get the goal that you have here to deal with money, and that is to subtract from the Constitution. That's right. It's ironic that mentioned here twice in the previous panels was the 17th Amendment. Do you realize what the 17th Amendment did? It took power away from you, the state legislature of Maryland, to appoint a senator that would do your will in Congress. What you directed them to do is what they must do. If they would not do it, you could recall that senator at will, and the history of our country shows that states did that and did that repeatedly. You lost power because of the 17th Amendment. I think if we subtracted the 17th Amendment, we could deal with the big money issues at the federal level. Thank you so much. I encourage an unfavorable report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Terry Kavanaugh, I'm the Executive Director of the Service Employees International Union, Maryland State Council. I think most of the comments that I would have made in either our written testimony or have been made by others, and would echo what others have said on the panel. And then I also want to say, Mr. Chairman, when you spoke, I agreed with virtually everything you said, talking about Citizens United, talking about McCutcheon, going back to Buckley. rich people and powerful people have gained more and more control of American politics. And when you have now trillion-dollar corporations, they don't even have to spend money. It's the threat that hangs over legislators and Congress that they get what they want just because they exist, with the potential of spending it. But I want to talk about a couple of things. One is the 1787 convention, and the way that I think the attempt that was written about the SJ1 is to try to restrict them to do things and only do what we want them to do. But there's two things. In 1787, the convention met in secret. So once people go in, they can do what they want. And the other thing is there's no provision that I see that people would be recalled if we didn't like what they were doing. The only enforcement or protection is, well, then maybe 38 states won't approve. And then the other thing I wanted to say is echo some comments about H.R. 1. We strongly support, SEIU strongly supports public financing, even though we do spend an awful lot of money in campaigns in Maryland and across the country from lower paid and middle class members. But we would encourage public financing. In fact, it's been mentioned where it's happened. It has not happened, as you all know, in the Maryland state legislature. That might be a good place to start and to see if we can deal directly and immediately with the money in politics in Maryland. Thank you.
Questions from the panel, committee? Questions for the panel? Well, I've got a couple. Mr. Shumitz, there was a federal tax cut about 18 months or 20 months ago that benefited a lot of the wealthiest corporations and individuals. Do you know how much was spent lobbying for that? Has your group looked at that at all?
No, we have not. We opposed that legislation, and we tried to educate members of the legislature and the public about the effects that would have in Maryland, but we did not look at the lobbying.
Right. I mean, you would agree that it pretty overwhelmingly benefited the top couple percent in this country?
Absolutely.
How were they able to pass that?
Because the people who wanted that to happen had control of Congress.
Right. So I guess that leads me to Mr. Effingham. I'd like to be as optimistic as you are that H.R. 1 is going to pass and solve our efforts. Clearly, the U.S. Senate and the White House are not quite there yet, maybe in 2 years. And I hope there are some changes, putting on my partisan hat. Although I'm not totally convinced that even with that, we'll have support for overturning Citizens United. You said democracy is breaking out everywhere. And look, I am, as you know, the sponsor of the public financing, which is voluntary because of Buckley v. Vallejo. We can't require it, so that's only voluntary. And we have been successful in Montgomery County, just had a great experience in democracy. And hopefully Howard and Prince George's will follow and we can pass via the state. I'm a little more pessimistic because I think those people in power who have the wealth are not going to give it up very easily. So that's why I'm supporting this bill and sponsoring this bill. And you quoted me, and someone talked about the direct election of U.S. senators. And I think organizing from the grassroots and putting pressure on other layers of government, levels of government, like Congress, is one way to make them act. And I have not seen any organized effort to make them act. And again, with all due respect to H.R. 1, which I support and will write letters on behalf of, but I'm not sure I see a mass movement on this issue. In fact, election reform and public campaign financing has not polled that great. Most people don't put it on their top 2, 3, 5, or 6 issues. And I think that's unfortunate because I'd like it to be. It's not, you know, it comes way after jobs, housing, education, and a lot of other issues, although it's been said here today, how policy is developed and who elects people to set that policy is at the underpinnings of labor, jobs, housing, education, many other issues. So should we just be optimistic, or do you have another strategy until we're in a situation where Citizens United McCutcheon is overturned?
Well, Senator, I did not present H.R. 1 or the public funding programs as the end solution. Instead, I present them as an alternative organizing strategy that actually changes the processes that we use and builds leaders who truly believe in that program, as opposed to this, which I believe, for the most part, is between two extremes. On the one hand, it would do nothing, but it also has the possibility to open up our Constitution to billionaire interests. And particularly as it's been presented here, with there being general agreement about the dangers of a convention that you yourself have mentioned in past years, this effort is honestly like trying to rob somebody while you're holding a Nerf gun. You know, are we going to threaten the convention that we are going to follow through with, or are we just going to say this and say that we've done something? I think public funding creates a new dynamic, and I think it builds community power in a way that this method doesn't, and I think that it protects the Constitution in a way that this does not at all. So that's why I present it as an alternate. It's not the end-all solution, but I think that this conversation has started and is well underway, and I think that it's our way to organize forward to solve this issue. And then one other thing, just to your question to Ms. Shumlitz, I just want to be clear. Citizens United, while it certainly impacts the money spent in elections, Citizens United, Buckley v. Vallejo, didn't really have anything to do with lobbying in those terms, just to be clear about that.
But the people who voted for it in the U.S. Senate, they're there by dint of contributions and the support of certain sectors of our society, unless I'm missing something.
Oh, certainly. I just wanted to be clear for the committee. And one other thing I want to be absolutely clear on. You, Chair, have been a fantastic leader on this. We just disagree on this one piece, and I don't want anything from my testimony to impugn your beliefs in this. We agree on more than we disagree on.
Not necessary. And finally, Mr. Whitney, I think I heard you quote from the Declaration of Independence.
I quoted from the Maryland Declaration of Rights, Article 1.
Right, but it's my understanding that the federal Constitution supersedes almost all policy and laws of our country.
Yes, and the Declaration of Independence is the organic law of these United States. So when the Declaration says the same thing that our Constitution, the Maryland Constitution, says that the people have a right to abolish a form of government when they deem it.
Right,
that's the federal law as well.
But
yes.
With all due respect, if that were the prevailing law, which essentially allows for revolution, which there are limitations in the Constitution of the United States for revolution, I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say the Declaration of Independence is a prevailing law of the land. I mean,
well, it is. It's the organic law. If you go to the law library, the first
we'll have
line,
to
it's right
agree
there,
to
the
disagree
organic
on
law.
that one.
It's an organic law.
In many ways, I would appreciate if that was the law for some of my ends. But in fact, it's the Constitution that does a number of things. It allowed for slavery, private property, and a number of other issues. So we can discuss that offline as well. Further questions? Seeing none, thank you. That concludes the hearing on SJ1. Committee, that concludes the hearings for today. Have a wonderful Valentine's Day. We do have hearings tomorrow.